What is happening here?
There's nothing left to say right now about that.
There are moments in reality television when silence feels louder than confession. For years, Sister Wives showed viewers emotional fractures, relationship breakdowns, and shifting loyalties. What it never clearly explained was how money, property, and long-term financial decisions were handled once the family structure began to crack. That omission didn't matter at first. But as marriages ended and narratives changed, viewers began noticing something unsettling. The emotional story no longer matched the financial one. And that's where the speculation began. Online discussions didn't erupt because of one shocking statement. They grew because of patterns, inconsistencies between what was said on camera and what appeared to happen off it. Property purchases, mortgage decisions, ownership questions, timing that didn't line up with explanations. At the center of that growing curiosity was Meri. Not because she was the loudest voice, but because she wasn't. Meri spent decades inside the family's financial and emotional core. She was present before the show. She experienced the early years when money was scarce, decisions were collective, and trust was assumed. And she remained there as fame, contracts, and property complicated everything. Yet when the family unraveled, Meri didn't rage publicly. She didn't accuse, she didn't expose, she didn't break down numbers. She spoke carefully. And careful language in situations involving money always raises questions. Viewers began revisiting moments involving property purchases and mortgages, especially those connected to Kody and Robin. They noticed explanations that shifted over time, justifications that changed depending on who was speaking, statements that emphasized emotion while avoiding structure. That's when the phrase alleged mortgage fraud started circulating online. Not because of court filings, not because of charges, but because fans sensed financial contradictions, situations where viewers felt the math, timelines, or stated reasons didn't fully align. It's important to say this clearly. Online allegations are not evidence, but they are signals of distrust, and distrust grows when transparency disappears. As fans pieced together interviews, episodes, and off-camera statements, a theory emerged that certain financial arrangements may have been framed one way publicly while functioning another way privately, especially when it came to who benefited, who carried risk, and who was excluded. Meri's name entered the conversation not as an accuser, but as a potential key. If anyone understood how mortgages were structured, how assets were handed, and how financial responsibility shifted, viewers believe it would be her. She had longevity, she had proximity, and most importantly, she had context. Context is dangerous, because context doesn't accuse, it explains. Fans began speculating that Meri's silence wasn't emotional exhaustion alone, it was restraint, that she knew exactly what she could say without opening financial questions that no one wanted publicly examined. Then something else happened. Viewers noticed tension between Kody and Robin whenever money was discussed. Not overt fighting, subtle friction, different explanations for the same event, emphasis on necessity versus sacrifice, responsibility reframed depending on who was speaking. These weren't explosive contradictions, they were quiet misalignments. Those misalignments fueled a new idea, that Kody and Robin weren't just protecting themselves from the audience, they were protecting themselves from each other. In financial matters, shared exposure creates mutual vulnerability. If one person speaks, the other is implicated. If narratives diverge, scrutiny increases. That's why fans began saying Kody and Robin were exposing each other, not through confession, but through inconsistency. One explanation here, a different emphasis there, just enough difference for viewers to notice. And once viewers notice, they don't stop looking. This is where Meri's role becomes central again. Fans don't believe Meri would blow the lid off in a dramatic, vengeful way. They believe she would do it quietly, by clarifying timelines, describing process, and explaining how decisions were actually made. That kind of exposure wouldn't accuse anyone of fraud. It would invite scrutiny. And scrutiny is what people fear most when finances are involved. The phrase mortgage fraud appears online because viewers lack the language to describe what they're sensing, a feeling that financial narratives were simplified, softened, or strategically framed to avoid deeper questions. In internet terms, those feelings become accusations. In reality, they're symptoms of missing transparency. Meri's restraint has kept those questions unanswered, but fans believe that restraint also protects Kody and Robin from having to reconcile their own versions of events publicly. Because once timelines are laid out, numbers discussed, and responsibility clarified, stories lose flexibility. And flexibility is power. To understand why the words alleged mortgage fraud gain traction among viewers, it's important to separate legal reality from public perception. Most financial scandals don't begin with proof. They begin with confusion. Mortgage-related allegations and public narratives almost always start the same way. Inconsistent explanations, unclear ownership, shifting responsibility, and timelines that don't fully align with what people are told. When those elements stack up, audiences don't assume complexity, they assume concealment. That's the environment in which these theories formed. On Sister Wives, financial conversations were rarely shown in full. They were summarized, softened, filtered through emotion rather than structure. Viewers were told what decisions meant, not how they were executed. At first, that wasn't suspicious, but as relationships ended, the financial story didn't simplify, it became murkier. Fans began revisiting moments involving home purchases, moves, and mortgages connected to Kody and Robyn. They noticed that explanations varied depending on context. One moment emphasized urgency, another emphasized sacrifice, another emphasized necessity. All could be true individually, but together they created friction. Mortgage allegations in public discourse don't require forged documents or illegal acts to ignite. They only require the sense that risk and benefit weren't evenly distributed, or that one person carried responsibility while another retained control. That's what viewers began questioning. Who signed what? Who assumed debt? Who held ownership? Who benefited long term? These questions were never clearly answered on camera. And where clarity is absent, speculation fills the gap. Meri's presence in these discussions is critical because she occupied a unique position. She wasn't the newest spouse. She wasn't the central authority figure. She was someone who had witnessed the family's financial evolution from simplicity to complexity. That makes her perspective valuable and potentially disruptive. Fans noticed that whenever property or mortgages came up, Meri's responses stayed surface level. She didn't contradict others. She didn't clarify numbers. She didn't explain process. She disengaged. That disengagement felt deliberate. In financial disputes, silence often means one of two things: lack of involvement or too much involvement. Viewers believe it's the latter. Another reason these allegations escalated is the language gap between what the family said and viewers inferred. For example, financial strain was often framed emotionally: stress, pressure, exhaustion, rarely structurally. Terms, liabilities, ownership. Emotion distracts from accountability. Structure demands it. When Kody spoke about finances, his explanations ebbed and shifted depending on the audience. Sometimes decisions were framed as shared, other times as unavoidable, other times as personal sacrifices made for the family. Robyn's explanations, according to viewers, tended to focus on necessity and fairness, but avoided mechanics. She emphasized why decisions felt right, not how they were implemented. That pattern isn't proof of wrongdoing, but it is a recipe for mistrust. Mortgage-related accusations often arise when people suspect that technical details are being hidden by emotional language. Viewers aren't accountants, but they understand fairness. When fairness feels absent, they search for explanation. This is where Kody and Robyn's narratives began to diverge subtly. Small differences in phrasing, different emphasis on responsibility, varying interpretations of the same event. None of these alone would matter. Together, they suggested something wasn't being coordinated. And when financial narratives stop aligning, suspicion grows quickly. Fans began saying Kody and Robyn were exposing each other, not because either confessed, but because their explanations no longer matched perfectly. In financial matters, even small inconsistencies feel large. Money demands precision. Emotion does not. Meri's silence during these moments became even more conspicuous. She didn't back either narrative. She didn't correct or reinforce. She stayed neutral, a position that often belongs to someone who knows the full picture and understands the risk of partial truth. Neutrality protects, especially when the alternative is scrutiny. Online discussions then escalated in language. Unclear mortgage became shady financing. Inconsistent explanation became possible fraud. This is how internet discourse works. It compresses uncertainty into accusation. But beneath that exaggerated language is a simpler concern. Were viewers told the whole financial story? And if not, why? That question keeps returning to Meri. Because if she explained how mortgages were structured, how decisions were made, and who bore the risk, it would either dissolve the theory completely or confirm that something important was left out. Either outcome would end speculation. Silence keeps it alive. The idea of mortgage fraud exists not because of evidence, but because of missing explanation. And missing explanation, when repeated over time, stops feeling accidental.
When money becomes complicated, power follows. That's the core reason financial silence feels heavier than emotional silence to viewers. In families, especially public ones, whoever controls the flow of money often controls the flow of narrative. Not because they're hiding something illegal, but because money determines leverage, and leverage determines who can speak freely. As fans examined the family's shifting financial landscape, they began connecting silence to power rather than pain. Emotional wounds heal, financial arrangements persist, and when those arrangements aren't explained clearly, they create hierarchies that don't need to be announced to be felt. This is where Meri's position stands out. Meri wasn't the newest spouse with the least context, nor the central decision-maker with the most authority. She occupied the in-between space, close enough to see how decisions were made, distant enough to feel their impact when priorities shifted. That position often produces the clearest perspective. From a viewer's standpoint, Meri's reduced influence over time coincided with increasing financial complexity. Early on, decisions were framed as collective. Later, they were framed as necessary. Eventually, they were framed as personal. That progression matters. When finances are collective, accountability is shared. When finances are necessary, accountability is blurred. When finances are personal, accountability disappears. Fans believe this transition quietly redistributed power. If mortgages and properties were structured in ways that placed risk on some individuals while consolidating control with others, then silence wouldn't just be polite, it would be protective. protective of stability, protective of income, protective of access. This is why Meri's silence reads differently to viewers than the silence of others. It doesn't feel like disengagement. It feels like constraint. Another layer of power viewers focus on is information asymmetry. Who knows what and when? In financial systems, those with more information can shape outcomes without confrontation. They don't need to argue, they simply proceed. Fans began suspecting that as financial decisions grew more complex, fewer people were included in their mechanics. Explanations were offered after the fact. Emotional reasoning replaced procedural clarity. That creates dependence. Dependence reduces voice. In that context, Meri speaking freely about mortgages, ownership, or responsibility wouldn't just clarify details, it would rebalance power by restoring information to the public conversation. That's why fans believe silence is not neutral. It preserves an imbalance. Viewers also noticed how financial topics affected interpersonal dynamics. Conversations became tense, language became careful, tone shifted from collaborative to defensive. These are common signs when money and authority overlap. Kody's reactions during financial discussions often appeared more intense than during emotional ones. That intensity suggested stakes beyond feelings, not wrongdoing, but control. Robyn's role in these moments appeared more measured. She emphasized fairness, necessity, and intent, often without addressing specifics. That approach reassures emotionally while avoiding structural scrutiny. It's effective, but it also keeps power concentrated. This is why fans say Kody and Robyn expose each other, not because they confess, but because their differing emphases reveal that there isn't one unified financial narrative. One stresses urgency, the other stresses fairness. One stresses responsibility, the other stresses circumstance. These differences are subtle, but money doesn't tolerate subtlety. Even minor inconsistencies suggest that decisions were made in layers, some visible, some not. Meri's neutrality during these moments becomes even more telling. She doesn't validate either explanation. She doesn't contradict. She doesn't add context. From a power perspective, that neutrality is strategic. Speaking partially would place her inside someone else's narrative. Speaking fully would invite scrutiny. Silence keeps her independent. Fans interpret this as evidence that Meri understands the power of information and the cost of releasing it. There's also the question of timing. Financial explanations were often delivered long after decisions were implemented. That delay reduces accountability because outcomes are already locked in. Questioning them becomes symbolic rather than practical. This pattern fuels the belief that power was exercised quietly, not aggressively, quietly. In systems where power is quiet, exposure doesn't require accusation. It requires illumination. Simply showing how decisions were made can change perception overnight. That's why the idea of Meri blowing the lid off resonates with viewers. They don't imagine her accusing anyone of fraud. They imagine her explaining how mortgages were structured, who bore risk, and when priority shifted. That explanation alone would answer years of questions, and it would redistribute power from narrative holders back to the audience. This is why silence persists, because power is rarely surrendered voluntarily. Not proof of wrongdoing, but proof of process. Who decided, how it was decided, who benefited, who carried risk. Those answers don't accuse. They clarify. And clarification is the one thing silence cannot allow with consequence. As viewers pushed deeper into the financial questions, attention shifted from structures to relationships, specifically the visible tension between Kody and Robyn whenever money or property entered the conversation. Not open conflict, subtle fracture. In reality television, true exposure rarely comes from confession. It comes from inconsistency. When two people are protecting the same narrative but for different reasons, cracks appear. Not because either intends to reveal anything, but because alignment becomes fragile. This is where fans believe Kody and Robyn began exposing each other. Not intentionally, not maliciously, but inevitably. Kody's approach to financial explanation has often leaned towards urgency and justification. Decisions are framed as unavoidable, necessary, forced by circumstance. His language suggests pressure, as though events happen to him rather than through him. Robyn's language, by contrast, leans towards balance and fairness. She emphasizes intent. She stresses emotional equity. She frames outcomes as the best possible solution under difficult conditions. Individually, both explanations can sound reasonable. Together, they don't always align. One narrative centers on pressure, the other centers on intention. That difference matters. When financial stories diverge in tone, viewers begin asking which version reflects reality, or whether both are incomplete. Mortgage-related speculation often grows from that exact gap, when responsibility feels both unavoidable and carefully managed. Fans don't interpret this as deception. They interpret it as compartmentalization. Each person explains the same decision from the angle that best protects their own vulnerability. But when those explanations coexist publicly, they create contrast, and contrast invites scrutiny. This is especially true when property and mortgages are involved. Financial decisions are not abstract. They involve documents, signatures, obligations, and risk. When explanations don't converge around those specifics, audiences sense avoidance. That's what happened here. Viewers noticed moments where Kody appeared frustrated during financial discussions, not because of the money itself, but because of the implication. His defensiveness read as fear of misunderstanding, misinterpretation, or loss of control over the story. Robyn's restraint, on the other hand, read as careful preservation. She avoided escalation, she avoided specifics. She leaned on emotion to keep conversations contained. From a viewer's perspective, these two strategies clashed. Not dramatically, but persistently. And persistence is what builds theory.
This tension becomes even more significant when Meri is factored in. Meri's silence acts as a counterweight to both narratives. She doesn't validate urgency, she doesn't validate fairness, she doesn't step in to reconcile the two. She lets them coexist. That choice intensifies the exposure. When two people explain the same financial situation differently, and a third party with full context refuses to clarify, viewers assume clarification would disrupt someone's version of events. This is why fans believe Kody and Robyn are locked in a fragile alliance, not because they're hiding wrongdoing, but because their shared interest is preventing reinterpretation. As long as explanations remain emotional and nonspecific, they can coexist without contradiction. But the moment process is explained, one narrative will dominate. And domination means consequence. This dynamic explains why viewers sense defensiveness even when accusations aren't made. It's not the accusation that creates anxiety, it's the possibility of alignment failing. In financial matters, alignment is everything. If Kody and Robyn were perfectly aligned on how decisions were made, how risk was distributed, and why outcomes occurred, there would be no room for speculation. The fact that viewers sense slight divergence suggests complexity that hasn't been addressed. And complexity without explanation becomes suspicions. Fans also point to moments where Robyn appears to distance herself subtly from decisions when scrutiny increases. Language shifts from "we decided to" "that's how it happened." Agency becomes diffuse, responsibility becomes abstract. This isn't proof of fraud, it's evidence of narrative self-protection. Similarly, Kody's explanations often emphasize sacrifice, what he gave up, what he endured, what he carried. That framing redirects focus from structure to emotion, from outcome to experience. Emotion invites empathy, structure invites evaluation. Meri's continued silence during these narrative shifts becomes more conspicuous. She doesn't intervene when explanations conflict. She doesn't offer context that could harmonize them. She allows divergence to remain visible. From a strategic perspective, this is powerful. She doesn't need to expose anyone. The inconsistency does that on its own. This is why fans say Kody and Robyn are exposing each other, not because they intend to, but because their need to protect themselves individually weakens their collective narrative. Silence once protected unity. Now it highlights fracture. And fracture is where theories grow strongest. The biggest risk to Kody and Robyn isn't Meri speaking loudly. It's Meri continuing to say nothing while their explanations slowly drift apart. Because silence doesn't just conceal, it reflects.
In controversies involving money, the loudest voice rarely holds the most power. The quietest one does. From the audience's perspective, Meri's restraint has gradually transformed her from a sidelined figure into the most consequential presence in the conversation. Not because she's accusing anyone, not because she's threatening exposure, but because she occupies the one position that neither Kody nor Robyn can fully control. She holds context. Context is different from opinion. Context is different from emotion. Context is different from accusation. Context explains how things happened. And that's why it's dangerous. Viewers believe that if Meri were to speak with specificity about process, timing, and responsibility, the entire financial narrative would either stabilize or collapse. There would be no middle ground. Clarification would force alignment or contradiction. Either outcome would end speculation. That gives Meri leverage. But leverage doesn't always mean action. Sometimes it means restraint. By not speaking, Meri preserves optionality. She can choose when to speak, how to speak, and how much to reveal. Everyone else must react to that possibility without knowing if or when it will materialize. This is why fans interpret Meri's silence as strategic rather than passive. In financial disputes, the person who can explain process holds more power than the person who explains outcome. Outcomes can be justified. Process must be defended. Kody and Robyn speak about outcomes. Meri can speak about process. That distinction is everything. Viewers believe Meri understands that once process is described, who initiated decisions, how mortgages were structured, where risk landed, the emotional framing collapses. Fairness can be evaluated. Responsibility can be traced. Narratives lose flexibility. This doesn't mean wrongdoing is revealed. It means clarity is restored. And clarity is often more destabilizing than accusation. Meri's leverage also explains why she hasn't rushed to tell her story. If she spoke emotionally, she would be dismissed as hurt. If she spoke selectively, she could be contradicted. If she spoke prematurely, she could lose control of timing. By staying silent, she controls all three. Fans also note that Meri's independence outside the family has grown quietly but steadily. Financial self-sufficiency changes power dynamics dramatically. When someone no longer relies on shared assets or approval, their silence becomes choice rather than necessity. Choice changes interpretation. Silence chosen from strength reads differently than silence chosen from fear. This shift is why viewers believe the balance has changed. Early on, Meri's restraint could be read as emotional exhaustion. Now it reads as confidence. She doesn't need to defend herself. She doesn't need to correct others. She doesn't need to rush clarity. Time is on her side. That reality puts pressure elsewhere.
Kody's explanations must remain consistent across years of footage. Robin's framing must continue to align with evolving public interpretation. Any misstep becomes amplified because Meri's silence creates a vacuum. In that vacuum, small inconsistencies loom large. This is the paradox viewers see. The more Meri stays quiet, the more responsibility shifts to those still explaining. Every new explanation carries risk. Every clarification must align with the past. Silence doesn't age, explanations do. From a strategic standpoint, Meri's position is unusually strong. She doesn't need to accuse. She doesn't need to defend. She doesn't need to persuade. She only needs to wait. That waiting feels speculation, not because she's manipulative, but because unresolved questions seek resolution. Audiences project answers on the person who could provide them. This projection also protects Meri. If she ever speaks, she won't be seen as reacting. She'll be seen as responding to a long-standing absence of clarity. That framing lends credibility before a word is said. It's why viewers believe Meri could blow the lid off without raising her voice, not by alleging fraud, but by explaining decisions. In financial narratives, explanation is exposure. That's why silence remains the most powerful position available. Meri doesn't need to expose anyone to change the story. Her continued restraint already has. If silence has become Meri's leverage, then the next question viewers keep asking is simple. What would make that leverage finally move? In any long-running public dispute, restraint holds only as long as it remains beneficial. Silence is not infinite, it's conditional, and those conditions shift as circumstances change. From the audience's perspective, Meri's silence makes sense as long as three things remain true. Her stability is intact, her reputation isn't directly threatened, and the narrative around her doesn't harden into blame. Silence protects dignity, it preserves optionality, it keeps doors open. But when any one of those conditions changes, restraint stops being protection and starts becoming liability. Viewers believe that if Meri ever speaks more clearly, it won't be because of anger, it will be because of correction. Correction happens when silence no longer shields truth. One potential trigger is misrepresentation. As long as other narratives remain vague or neutral toward Meri, silence remains viable. But if explanations evolve in ways that indirectly place responsibility on her, financially, emotionally, or structurally, the calculus changes. Silence then allows an inaccurate version of events to solidify, and solidified narratives are difficult to undo. Another trigger viewers point to is financial exposure without context. When financial topics surface publicly without full explanation, speculation grows sharper. If Meri's name or past decisions are invoked without detail, silence becomes a risk. At that point, clarity becomes self-defense. This is often how long-held silence ends, not with a dramatic reveal, but with a measured explanation intended to prevent misunderstanding. Fans also believe timing matters more than emotion. NDAs, settlements, and contractual obligations often include sunset clauses or topic limitations. Silence may not be permanent, it may be procedural. When certain timelines pass, the risk associated with speaking drops. And when risk paps, truth becomes affordable. Another factor is distance. As time passes, emotional attachment weakens. People who once avoided speaking to preserve relationships eventually realize those relationships no longer exist in any functional way. At that point, restraint stops serving its original purpose. Viewers believe Meri may already be approaching that phase. Not because she wants conflict, but because clarity no longer threatens connection that has already ended. There's also the issue of audience expectation. Silence creates curiosity. Curiosity becomes anticipation. Over time, anticipation turns into demand. Not vocal demand, but interpretive pressure. Viewers begin constructing their own explanations, and those explanations can be harsher than reality. At some point, allowing speculation to run unchecked becomes more damaging than offering clarification. That's the paradox of silence in the public eye. It protects initially, then it distorts. Fans believe this is where the alleged mortgage fraud language becomes relevant, not as a legal claim, but as a symptom. When audiences don't receive clear explanations, they use the strongest language available to describe uncertainty. Fraud becomes shorthand for, this doesn't add up. That's not fair, but it's predictable. From that standpoint, Meri speaking doesn't escalate the situation, it de-escalates it. Explanation replaces imagination, process replaces assumption. But speaking has consequences. Once process is explained, it can't be unexplained. Once responsibility is clarified, it can't be redistributed emotionally. That's why the decision to speak is weighty. Fans don't believe Meri would take that step lightly. They believe she would wait until clarity benefits more people than it disrupts. This brings the focus back to Kody and Robin. As long as their narratives remain aligned enough to prevent hard contradiction, silence holds. But as soon as explanations drift too far apart, pressure increases. Viewers don't need proof, they only need misalignment. And misalignment accumulates. Each slightly different explanation compounds scrutiny. Each reframing invites contradiction. Over time, the story demands reconciliation, either internally or publicly. Silence delays that moment. It doesn't prevent it. Viewers also consider the possibility that Meri may never speak fully, and that's meaningful too. Silence can be a statement of boundaries. It can signal refusal to participate in reinterpretation altogether. But even that choice carries consequence. Because if silence remains permanent, the audience leak the story on its own. And that story may be far harsher than reality. From here, the question isn't whether Meri can speak. It's whether continued silence still serves her interests, or anyone else's.
By the time speculation reaches this stage, the story no longer belongs solely to the people involved. It belongs to the audience. And that changes everything. Once viewers believe financial truth is being withheld, power quietly shifts away from those controlling the narrative and toward those interpreting it. In reality television, perception is currency, and perception doesn't wait for confirmation. It moves faster than clarification ever can. Fans didn't arrive at the idea of alleged mortgage fraud because they wanted scandal. They arrived there because repeated ambiguity trained them to distrust simplified explanations. When viewers feel talked around instead of talked to, they assume something is being protected. That assumption reshapes power. At this point, Kody and Robin no longer control how their explanations are received, only how often they're questioned. Every new financial reference is filtered through skepticism. Every vague statement is compared to past ones. Every shift in tone becomes evidence of instability. This is the cost of prolonged silence. What once looked like discretion now looks like avoidance, and avoidance invites interpretation. Audience-driven interpretation is uniquely powerful because it doesn't require proof. It operates on pattern recognition. Viewers don't claim to know what happened. They claim to know something doesn't align. That claim is difficult to refute because alignment requires detail, and detail is what's missing. This is why silence stops working once speculation becomes communal. One viewer wonders, another confirms the feeling, a third supplies a theory. Soon, the theory feels established, not because it's proven, but because it explains behavior better than official narratives do. That's where the power shifts. From a strategic standpoint, this is the most dangerous phase for anyone trying to contain a story. Silence no longer preserves stability. It fuels alternative explanations that are harder to control than truth. For Meri, this shift places her in an unusual position. Her silence is no longer just personal restraint. It's become a focal point. Viewers now look to her as the potential stabilizer, the person who could end speculation by explaining process rather than emotion. That expectation creates pressure. Not to accuse, but to clarify. For Kody and Robin, the pressure is different. They aren't expected to explain process. They're expected to defend outcome. And defending outcome without process feels increasingly inadequate to an audience trained to look for inconsistency. This asymmetry deepens suspicion. Fans begin asking, if nothing improper occurred, why not explain the mechanics? Why not outline timelines, ownership, and responsibility clearly? Why rely on emotional framing when structure would resolve confusion? The absence of those explanations is interpreted as strategy. Again, this doesn't prove wrongdoing, but it proves vulnerability. Public vulnerability is costly in reality TV because it undermines authority. Once viewers believe you're managing perception rather than explaining reality, credibility erodes quickly. This is where the phrase, "they're exposing each other," takes on new meaning. Kody and Robin don't need to contradict each other outright. They only need to emphasize different priorities. Over time, those differences compound. One explanation feels defensive, another feels incomplete. Together, they suggest something unresolved. The audience notices, and once noticed, it can't be unseen. Meanwhile, Meri's restraint continues to read as intentional. She doesn't rush to fill gaps. She doesn't correct speculation. She allows theories to circulate with confirmation or denial. From a power perspective, that's risky, but also calculated. Silence allows Meri to remain outside the interpretive conflict. She isn't responsible for shaping speculation. She isn't responsible for correcting it. She simply exists as the missing variable. Missing variables attract attention. The longer the audience debates without resolution, the more they expect some form of closure. And closure rarely comes from those perceived as managing narratives. It comes from those perceived as having nothing left to protect. That perception favors Meri. This is the paradox viewers now recognize. Silence gave others short-term protection, but it gave Meri long-term credibility. By refusing to speak prematurely, she positioned herself as someone who values accuracy over attention. Accuracy carries weight. As speculation intensifies, even small clarifications from Meri would have outsized impact. She wouldn't need to allege misconduct. She wouldn't need to challenge anyone directly. Simply explaining how decisions were made would recalibrate years of discussion. That's why the audience believes silence is no longer neutral. It's active. Active silence shapes power just as much as speech. In this phase, the story has crossed a threshold. Containment is no longer about preventing exposure. It's about preventing reinterpretation. And reinterpretation is far harder to control because it happens collectively.
Once a collective decides something doesn't add up, the burden of proof shifts. Silence stops protecting innocence. It invites explanation. Once speculation reaches a critical mass, silence is no longer the strongest option. It becomes the most dangerous one. From the audience's perspective, the conversation has now shifted from whether something happened to why it hasn't been explained. That shift is subtle, but it changes everything. Viewers stop demanding proof and start demanding clarity. And clarity doesn't require accusation. It requires structure. This is why fans believe that even partial explanation, not a full exposé, could completely reset the conversation. Not a tell-all, not receipts, just a clear outline of process, who decided what, when decisions were made, and how responsibility was distributed. That level of explanation would dissolve most speculation overnight, but it would also come at a cost. Selective honesty is powerful because it controls scope. It answers enough questions to restore credibility without opening every door. But selective honesty also commits the speaker to consistency. Once details are offered, they can't be walked back or reframed emotionally. That's why it's risky. For Kody and Robin, selective honesty would mean choosing which parts of the financial story to clarify and which to keep abstract. That requires coordination. It requires alignment, and alignment has already shown signs of strain. Any mismatch would deepen suspicion rather than resolve it. From a viewer standpoint, this is why silence has continued, not because truth is explosive, but because truth is binding. Once process is explained, everyone is locked into it. Past statements must align. Future explanations must be consistent. Silence avoids that trap, but only temporarily. The longer silence persists, the more viewers assume that selective honesty is being avoided because it would expose imbalance, not criminal wrongdoing, but uneven risk, unequal control, or decisions that benefited some while disadvantaging others. That assumption hardens over time. This is the stage where audience theories become resistant to correction. Even factual explanations can be dismissed as damage control if they arrive too late or feel incomplete. That's the paradox of delayed transparency. The longer you wait to explain, the less credible the explanation feels. Meri's role in this phase becomes even more significant. Because she hasn't explained anything, any explanation she gives would feel fresh rather than defensive. She wouldn't be correcting herself. She would be clarifying the record. That difference matters. Viewers don't expect Meri to reveal wrongdoing. They expect her to explain dynamics, and dynamics are harder to dispute than accusations. This is why fans believe Meri holds the only explanation capable of stabilizing the story without escalating it. But stabilization may no longer be the goal. At this point, the conversation has become self-sustaining. Content creators, commentators, and viewers are generating engagement around unanswered questions. Silence is no longer preventing attention, it's generating it. That changes incentives. In media ecosystems, attention is value. Speculation creates content. Content creates revenue. That reality complicates the decision to clarify. This may be why partial explanations have been avoided, not out of guilt, but out of calculation. For Kody and Robin, maintaining ambiguity may feel safer than risking reinterpretation. For Meri, maintaining silence may feel dignified, but increasingly isolating. The longer the story goes unresolved, the more she becomes the focal point of expectation. Expectation can become burden. Fans don't just want answers, they want closure. And closure doesn't come from those perceived as managing narratives. It comes from those perceived as stepping outside them. This is why even a modest clarification from Meri, about timing, about process, about her own understanding, could shift the entire conversation. Not because it proves anything, but because it restores trust in explanation itself. Trust doesn't require perfection. It requires coherence. At this stage, coherence is what's missing most. Silence once preserved coherence by limiting information. Now it fractures it by allowing multiple interpretations to coexist unchecked. That's the turning point, and it leads to the final phase of this analysis.
By this stage, silence has crossed a line. It no longer reads as discretion. It reads as avoidance under pressure. From the audience's point of view, this is the moment when unresolved questions begin to harden into assumptions. Not because viewers want scandal, but because human nature demands coherence. When stories stretch on without explanation, people don't wait patiently forever. They decide what makes sense. And once that decision is made collectively, reversing it becomes nearly impossible. This is why prolonged ambiguity is more dangerous than clarification. In the early years, financial explanations on sister wives were accepted because the family structure appeared intact. Trust existed. Viewers assumed fairness because unity was still visible. But as unity fractured, trust fractured with it. When trust disappears, every unanswered question becomes heavier. At this point, fans believe the silence around financial specifics has created a vacuum that no emotional explanation can fill. Discussions of stress, pressure, or sacrifice no longer satisfy. Viewers want process. They want to understand how decisions were made, not just how they felt. And when that understanding is denied repeatedly, suspicion becomes the default. This is the phase where silence actively reshapes perception. It doesn't merely withhold information, it signals that information is being managed. That signal alone undermines credibility, even if no wrongdoing exists. Kody's position becomes increasingly fragile here. Every attempt to explain decisions emotionally is interpreted as deflection. Every defensive reaction is read as confirmation of vulnerability. Not guilt, vulnerability. And vulnerability suggests something to protect. Robin's careful framing also begins to lose effectiveness. What once felt empathetic now feels rehearsed to some viewers. When emotional language is repeated without structural clarity, it stops sounding sincere. Consistency without substance breeds doubt. Meanwhile, Meri's silence reaches a new interpretation. It no longer reads as withdrawal, it reads as containment. Viewers don't see her as disengaged, they see her as holding back. That distinction is critical. Holding back implies intention. Intention implies choice. Choice implies power. At this stage, Meri's restraint becomes the strongest signal that something meaningful remains unexplained. If nothing significant existed, viewers believe, there would be nothing to hold back. Again, this is perception, not proof. But perception drives narrative. The phrase alleged mortgage fraud persists in online discussion, not because evidence has surfaced, but because language escalates when clarity is denied. Fraud becomes shorthand for we don't understand how this was allowed to happen. It's an expression of confusion turned suspicion. And once suspicion dominates, even honest explanations face resistance. Viewers begin questioning motives by timing. Why now? Why this detail and not that one? Why explain some things but not others? Delayed transparency is rarely received neutrally. This is why fans believe silence has become unsustainable. Not because legal exposure is imminent, but because reputational exposure already exists. At this stage, any future explanation will be judged not just on accuracy, but on timing, and timing always invites motive analysis. Why now? Why this detail and not that one? Why explain some things but not others? Delayed transparency is rarely received neutrally. This is why fans believe silence has become unsustainable. Not because legal exposure is imminent, but because reputational exposure already exists. At this stage, any future explanation will be judged not just on accuracy, but on timing, and timing always invites motive analysis. Why now? Why this detail and not that one? Why explain some things but not others? Silence has ensured that those questions will accompany any disclosure. That's the cost of waiting too long. The audience now sees three possible outcomes. 1. Silence continues indefinitely. Speculation becomes canon. The unanswered questions become part of the legacy. 2. Partial clarification arrives from those already perceived as managing narrative. It's dismissed as damage control. 3. Clarification arrives from the person perceived as least invested in protecting the story, Meri, and because of that perception, it carries weight. This is why viewers believe Meri holds the final lever. Not because she intends to use it, but because everyone knows she could. That knowledge shapes behavior even in silence. It shapes how others speak, how they phrase explanations, how they avoid detail. Silence becomes a shadow over every conversation. And shadows grow longer the light is withheld. By this point, the story has evolved beyond finances. It's about trust, credibility, and who gets to define reality after years of curated storytelling. The audience no longer expects perfection. They expect honesty. Not emotional honesty, structural honesty. How things worked, why decisions were made, who carried risk, who benefited. Without those answers, silence will continue to be interpreted as protection, not of truth, but of imbalance. By the end of this story, one truth stands out more clearly than any allegation ever could. Silence didn't end the questions, it created them. What began as emotional distance slowly became a credibility issue, not because anyone proved wrongdoing, but because explanations never fully matched outcomes. Over time, the absence of clear process turned routine financial decisions into symbols of imbalance. And once that happens, the narrative is no longer controlled by facts alone, it's shaped by trust, or the lack of it. From the audience's perspective, this wasn't a hunt for scandal, it was a search for coherence. Viewers wanted to understand how decisions were made when the family structure changed, who carried risk, who held authority, and how those realities were communicated. Instead, they were given emotion without mechanics, reassurance without timelines, and outcomes without explanation. That gap became the story. The phrase alleged mortgage fraud didn't rise because of documents or court filings. It rose because the language available to describe unresolved confusion hardened over time. When people don't receive clarity, they escalate language, not to accuse, but to express disbelief. And disbelief is corrosive. For Kody and Robin, silence initially served a purpose.
It preserved flexibility. It allowed explanations to remain broad and adaptive. It avoided reopening decisions that were already finalized. In the short term, it protected stability. But stability built on ambiguity has an expiration date. As seasons passed and narratives evolved, every new explanation carried the weight of the past. Each shift in emphasis, urgency here, fairness there, added another layer of interpretive strain. Viewers began comparing not just words, but patterns, and patterns are harder to dismiss than moments. This is where the idea of exposing each other took hold, not as accusation, but as consequence. When two people explain the same financial reality differently, even subtly, alignment weakens, and when alignment weakens, the audience fills the space. Meanwhile, Meri's role transformed quietly. Her silence, once read as withdrawal, became restraint. Restraint became credibility. Credibility became expectation. Viewers didn't see her as avoiding the truth, they saw her as containing it. That perception matters, because in public narratives, perception decides who is trusted to close the story, not the loudest voice, not the most emotional one, the one who waited. By refusing to participate in partial explanations, Meri avoided being trapped inside anyone else's version of events. She didn't validate urgency, she didn't validate fairness, she didn't harmonize contradictions, she let them stand. That changed the power dynamic. Silence became leverage, not as threat, but as possibility. Everyone knew that a calm, factual explanation from her about timing, process, and responsibility could recalibrate years of speculation, not by alleging wrongdoing, but by restoring coherence. And coherence is the one thing ambiguity cannot survive. This is why, in the end, the truth, if it ever arrives, won't arrive as an exposé. It won't come with dramatic language or sweeping claims. It will arrive quietly, in explanation rather than accusation, in structure rather than emotion. It will sound like this. Here's how decisions were made. Here's when they were made. Here's who carried what risk. Here's what changed and why. That kind of truth doesn't inflame. It resolves. But resolution comes with cost. Once clarity exists, narratives lose flexibility. Past statements must align. Future explanations must remain consistent. The story becomes anchored to process instead of feeling. That's why silence lasted as long as it did, and that's why it became unsustainable. At this stage, the audience no longer expects perfection. They expect honesty that respects their intelligence. They understand complexity. They can accept hard choices. What they reject is being kept at arm's length from the mechanics of decisions that shaped real lives. Silence protected reputations for a time, but it also reshaped them. It turned unanswered questions into assumptions. It turned restraint into suspicion. It turned financial complexity into moral doubt. None of that requires guilt. It requires absence. The legacy of this story, then, isn't about whether allegations are true or false. It's about what happens when explanation is delayed long enough that trust erodes, when clarity is withheld until imagination takes over, when silence becomes louder than speech. If cloaked for her puns, it won't rewrite the past. It will simply make it legible. And in a story built on years of curated reality, legibility may be the most disruptive force of all. Because once people understand how something happened, they no longer need to guess why. And guessing is where the damage was done.